Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sustainable Development Panel, 1st of October 2020. First of all, do we have any apologies, please?
Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Graham, and I understand Councillor Schmierer is joining us later. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest, please? No. Can we just agree the accuracy of the meetings? We've got 15th of January 2020 and the 15th of July 2020. So I'll take the 15th of January first. I won't ask for matters arising on that because we've had another meeting subsequently. So are these a correct record? Yes, thumbs up, thank you. Okay, let's go then to the meeting on the 22nd of July. Here we are. Are these a correct record, please? Yep. Okay, thank you. Any matters arising that won't be covered on the main agenda today? Page.
Chair, we don't normally take matters arising.
I'm on autopilot. Thank you. You've reminded me of that before as well. Let's move on then. Now, officers have suggested that we change the order of the items on the agenda to reflect their relative importance. So the proposal is we start with the planning consultations. We then have a verbal update on the GNLP after yesterday's meeting. We then take the Article 4 direction update, and then we have the statement of community involvement temporary amendments update. So is the meeting content to accept that change of order? Yep. Great. Okay, good. Right. So let's start then with the government consultations on the planning white paper and changes to the current planning system. They would be on page 25. So it's item 5 on your agenda, starting on page 25. So I'm assuming Graham or Judith are going to lead on this. Is it Judith? Yeah, Judith.
I'll mute myself. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you. Can I just check with you first of all? It's quite a long paper. It sounds like maybe not everybody's had a chance to read it in full. I was wondering whether you wanted me to take you through the report, in some detail, or just to do a summary of the proposals before looking at the responses in more detail. I'm happy to do whatever you would prefer.
Well, let's check, because I know there's been a little bit of debate in our respective groups about these issues prior to full council, where there was a motion. So it may be that people are quite well informed, but I'll be led by the meeting really in terms of what you would prefer to do. So do people, particularly those who might have had a problem receiving their paper agenda, would they like to have a more fulsome explanation of the issue, or are they content just to have an overview and more time for debate? What do indicate if you've got a view. I've got people sticking their thumbs up for the second option. Yeah, more time for debate and less of an intro. Okay, fine. Yes, Kevin.
I'm just wondering, because members of the public are admitted to this meeting, some kind of summary. Oh yeah,
I'm not suggesting we don't have a summary. I'm suggesting that we, instead of going through sort of line by line, that we just have more of an overview, which I think that's what you were saying, Judith, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I was going to give you a bit of a quick summary. Fairly, there's still quite a lot to say actually about the proposals.
There is, yeah.
Even in summary, actually, but just rather than taking you through all the report, which is quite long, but I will dwell more on the actual responses. I think that's the bit you'll probably want to be focusing on more. But then, just by way of introduction, if that's okay, then we've the government has published 2 consultation documents, the planning white paper and changes to the current planning system. The white paper deadline is 29th of October, and the deadline for the second consultation is actually today. So what we intend to do is, following the discussion today, if we've got any comments to amend the responses to either of those consultations, the planning white paper response will be amended and will be discussed at Cabinet on the 14th of October, prior to being submitted to the government by the 29th of October. But our response today to the second consultation, the change to the current planning system, will need to be submitted today. So if there's any comments and changes to the response, we'll need to update that response today and send it off to government by the end of the day. So that's just by way of introduction. The both consultations propose very major changes to the planning system. And our approach in doing the consultation responses has not been to complete the very sort of detailed response form that the government provides for each consultation. We've done that in the past, and we find that it's taken a lot of time to do. It hasn't really made much of a difference. And what we've done more recent years is really just to set out our comments in a report and send that to the government. And we feel that makes a more provides much a clearer message to government about our views, and it means that we don't necessarily answer every single question within the consultation. So anyway, just by way of background, as you're aware, because we've had various reports to this panel over the years, there's been the direction of travel is that the government has been for the last few years proposing that it'll make major changes to the planning system. We've had the Housing White Paper in 2017, Planning for the Right Homes in the Right Places in 2017 as well. We've had consultations on starter homes and on first homes. So that's been the direction of travel. It's all about housing delivery and raising the number of units of housing delivered on an annual basis, and the government's target is 300,000 per annum. And the other bit of context, just important to state, is about the ongoing deregulation of the planning system and relaxations in like changes of use, more flexibility in changes of use, and as we'll discuss in another report in relation to the Article 4 direction, we've had recent changes to the use classes order, which is less increased flexibility in terms of changes of use and resulting in a loss of control over the planning process by local authorities. So that's the sort of background to the current consultations. So the first thing I thought I would just take you through a sort of high-level summary of the Planning White Paper. This is a quite lengthy document in its own right. It's about 84 pages long, and it's very high-level itself, and it lacks a lot of details. So that makes it quite difficult in some cases to respond very much. But the key proposals, I'll focus on them. One of the key proposals is to simplify the local plan system using rules-based planning and zoning. And they're proposing 3 zones. A growth zone where substantial development would have outline approval granted automatically for allocations. A renewal zone, which is suitable for some development and densification with a presumption in favour of development, and a protection zone, which would be a zone such as conservation areas where development is restricted. So this is the proposal that is the zoning proposal coming forward from the White Paper. There's also a statutory requirement to adopt a local plan within 30 months or have government intervention, and that's obviously a very challenging timescale for local plan production. We'll come on to that a bit more later in terms of our response to that. Other proposals include design codes to sit alongside local plans, and they would be informed by stakeholder and public engagement. And they, as I say, they're important documents to sit alongside the local plans. Increase community participation at plan making stage, but less at the decision making stage. There's a focus on improving the sort of modernising the planning system and making it more digitally up to date, and including digital forms of engagement with it. There's a requirement for sustainability appraisals for local plans to be scrapped and to be replaced with a sustainable development test. And we don't have a lot of detail about what that would include. And the duty to cooperate would be scrapped as well. And this is something that's been in place for about 10 years. And it came into effect when the sort of strategic planning system was dismantled. And it is our way of cooperating on cross-border issues. So that is proposed to be scrapped as well. And And in terms of housing delivery, each local authority is to be given a housing requirement to be met through local plans. And that's going to be based on a new standard method of assessing housing need. And that standard method is part of the second consultation, so I'll come on to that in a minute. The housing delivery test will be retained, but the requirement for the 5-year land supply test, supply requirement is likely to be dropped. There are some proposals for promoting greater delivery on sites by requiring large sites to be packaged into different sort of areas, so multiple developers can take forward those different parcels of land and hopefully develop them at so overall development will be at a faster rate. A major proposal in the white paper is a new nationally set infrastructure levy to replace SIL and Section 106 agreements. And that would be based on the value of a development delivered and payable on completion of development. And there's flexibility in terms of the infrastructure levy, potentially that it could include affordable housing. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of the planning white paper. In terms of the other consultation, it covers 4 different aspects. The first is the changes to the standard method for assessing housing need. And I'll go into that when we get to the response in a minute, but that has that new method has sort of widespread ramifications for the level of housing need across the country actually and locally. Securing first homes, which is a type of market discount affordable housing for first-time buyers through developer contributions. Lifting the small sites threshold, that's the threshold below which developers do not need to contribute to affordable housing from the current level, which is 10 units, to either 40 or 50 homes. So that's implications for affordable housing delivery. And extending the current permission in principle regime from it currently only applies to minor development, less than 10 units, to major development. So those are the proposals in the second of the 2 consultations. So is it okay then if I just move on now to discussing the potential responses to those 2 consultations, and we'll probably can bring in some more of the actual detail. So excuse me while I get to the right part of the, so the response to the planning white paper starts on page 32 of the papers, the agenda papers. So I've sort of organized it with different sort of subheadings. And the first one is to do with plan making. And this part of the report sets out that we've got major concerns about the proposed zoning of growth, renewal and protection areas. And particularly, we just don't have an awful lot of information how that would work. So for example, Norwich City Centre is a focus of growth and centre of the regional economy, yet most of it is a conservation area. So that really begs the question, how would that be defined in this very simplified zoning system? It is proposed that we would like to get obviously detailed guidance on to assist us in this process, and we obviously are very concerned that we don't want this to not reflect the sort of diversity of different local authority areas, including Norwich, obviously, the character and diversity of different places, and the existing levels of environmental protection and enhancement. And obviously the introduction of a new zoning system will be disruptive to the local plan process. So, and will require a lot of training and, of planning officers in the new approaches to be, once the detail is fully fleshed out. The statutory 30-month time limit for local plans seems to be very unrealistic based on our experience to date. So far, for example, the Greater Norwich local plan has been about 4 years in the making. And it's very hard to reconcile this proposal to reduce the time for preparation with the proposal also to have greater public involvement in the plan making stage of the process. So that does seem to be very sort of badly thought out. It's obviously something it's desirable to have to prepare local plans in a shorter time frame, but little evidence is provided as to how this approach would actually speed up planning. So the other aspect of growth areas, this growth zone, is that the planning white paper calls for master plans and design codes to be produced to inform the sites within the growth zone. And from experience, these will take quite a lot of time to be prepared. So that's another question mark really, as about the realisticness of this time frame. So and this local plan would be streamlined, and development management process would be streamlined as well. For example, in a growth area, by virtue of having an allocation, that particular site would get an outline planning consent through that allocation. So that means that you're not going to have a planning application going to the committee so that reduces the flexibility of councils as well to set policy to respond to local issues and to reflect local market conditions. The streamlining of the local plan process, and we feel it's very important for local authorities to be able to respond effectively to local issues. And I know that there are some issues that were, I think, raised recently at Scrutiny Committee in relation to issues such as the impact of short-term lets and holiday homes, for example, or and that, that's something that there's a big question mark over how can we respond to that if we have these sort of if national policies are set more at a national level rather than at a local level. And it also questions the ability of policies in our local plans to control changes of use under permitted development, for example, such as we're going to be talking about soon in relation to this Article 4 direction for changes of use from office to residential. And basically the rules-based approach seems to be very simplistic in terms of how it will deal with a place such as Norwich with complex site-specific constraints. And the view from our development management colleagues that it might be more realistic for large urban extensions, for example, to have a sort of more rules-based approach, but less realistic for the complex urban areas which have got differences in, their constraints and viability and so on. So that's another concern. And then moving on to strategic planning, it's difficult, as I said earlier on, to see how we're going to be able to deal with strategic cross-boundary issues without the duty to cooperate in the absence of a strategic planning system. And when we come on to talk about the implications of the housing need, the revised method for housing need in a few minutes, you'll see that raises issues about how we will effectively deal with those sorts of issues across local authority boundaries if we don't have this duty to cooperate. And obviously you're aware that we've been cooperating in the Greater Norwich Development Partnership for many years now, and also in the Norfolk Strategic Planning Framework. And that's been very valuable in terms of addressing cross-boundary strategic issues, and as well as doing things like working on joint evidence studies, and it's quite resource efficient way of doing that as well. And it's also hard to see how we're going to be able to, if we have this new infrastructure levy, which I'll talk about in a minute, that will how we'll be able to align our infrastructure investment if we're not working across borders. There's also a major sort of area of concern. I'm on page 34, by the way, of the report at the moment, on local democracy and consultation and accountability generally. The focus on participation at the plan making stage rather than the application and decision making stage is likely to severely curtail opportunities for engagement in the planning system. Local authorities, from our experience, local communities don't tend to engage very effectively in local plan making, especially in the early stages of local plan making when the proposals are less tangible, maybe than at planning application stage when people can see what they're going to be looking at. And also this approach raises concerns about the local authority planning committees in providing democratic oversight, as it says in paragraph 28. It's not clear how there's no detail under the proposals about how neighbours and other interested parties can comment on proposals, where the principle of development has already been accepted through the allocation of sites in a growth area, for example. And there would be meaningful public engagement under the new proposals at only 2 stages of the local plan preparation process, and currently, and that on the face of it might look reasonable, but we've actually had I think 4 periods of consultation on the Greater Norwich Local Plan to date. And, you know, they've been felt to be required at each point in time, you know, so it's debatable really whether this is sufficient opportunity for people, public and stakeholders, to be meaningfully involved in the plan making process. And in relation to public examinations, although the proposed white paper proposals don't include, they're proposed to continue, they have an option that is to remove the public examination process and to have a for local planning authorities to undertake a process of self-assessment, and that would again remove public input and remove the right to be heard at the public examination stage. And I've just noted in paragraph 30 that it could also raise the possibility that a local authority could adopt a plan that would have significant implications for its neighbours. And, you know, so for example, where a rural district adjacent to a city allocates land for out of centre development, which could impact on the viability of city centre. So it does raise unpalatable issues, really. Then under placemaking and sustainability on page 35 of the report, there's quite a lot of, there's little reference to ensuring that local plans are climate ready, and the zoning proposals have no detail really in there at all about climate change and how to address that. There's a need for greater clarity about how the impacts of new development will be assessed under the new proposals, with the abolition of the sustainability appraisal from the local plan process. There's no detail as to how the simplified assessment process would work. So it does raise questions about how environmental impacts will be assessed and screened in growth areas particularly. And whether environmental impact assessment will be required at application stage, at the detailed application stage. Apparently there will be an additional consultation in this autumn about the new sort of proposed simplified assessment process. So, you know, that's something we need to look at when it comes in. There's a proposal in the white paper for new homes to be carbon neutral by 2050, which is doesn't appear to be terribly ambitious, given it's been pushed back from 2016 more recently. And there's no ambition about retrofitting of new homes to be, you know, to reduce energy demand, and so that's another element that's lacking from the white paper. Moving on to the digital transformation of planning, there are obviously benefits arising from those proposals, and it's, you know, it's important to really modernise the planning system and bring it into the 21st century, as the document says. We would welcome that, generally speaking. And obviously, I think there'll need to be sort of training and support for local authorities in doing that. And the idea, I think, is that local plans will become map-based plans, which people will be able to access digitally, for example. But also, it's really important, as I've noted at paragraph 35, that we don't exclude people who aren't able to use digital technology or don't wish to use that. So that's an important consideration. With design, there's a strong focus on design quality and beauty, and requirement for local authorities to produce design codes. These would need to be, our comment would be that these need to be really responsive to the local environment, and they need to be very context specific. The government is intending to produce a national design code which will inform these local design codes, but, you know, again, we need more detail about how these are going to work, and it's really important that we have ensure that there's sufficient public and stakeholder engagement in the process. And again, that's, as I've noted there, that's going to have some impact on timescales for affecting local plan delivery again. Housing delivery, there's a bit of crossover in the comments on housing delivery with the comments in the changes to the current planning system, the other consultation, which I'll come on to in a minute, because this is where the new revision to the standard methodology comes in. But essentially, the white paper imposes binding housing requirement figures that will be based on the revised standard method. So that's what they're proposing, and we would contest that those are not necessarily going to guarantee delivery of raised levels of housing. Because if we said in a number of previous consultations to date on the same sort of issue, it's not the planning system that's holding up the delivery of housing, it's other factors such as developers land banking their sites. And I'll come on to the delivery of affordable housing under the second consultation, because it's probably more relevant to that. But again, as it says in paragraph 42 of this report, as with previous reforms, there's a narrow emphasis on increasing the supply of land for market housing, and it risks crowding out other important planning objectives. With the infrastructure delivery section on page 37, the creation of a new infrastructure levy is the purpose of that by merging SIL and Section 106 requirements and planning obligations, is to raise more revenue than under the current system and to deliver at least as much affordable housing. And obviously, it is quite a complex system that we've got at the moment. However, we do have a number of concerns about the proposals. The infrastructure levy would be payable on the completion of development, not on the commencement of development, as with the current community infrastructure levy. So that's going to present issues in terms of the delivery of infrastructure, as payments not going to be made until later in the day. And it's going to be important to understand how that's going to impact on land values and viability of development. There's also, the proposals also include a threshold below which infrastructure levy wouldn't be sought on developments of marginal viability. So that means that across the country, really, there aren't any, the higher value areas are likely to get higher infrastructure levy receipts, and the converse is also true for lower value areas. So that doesn't seem very equitable. Again, and this is a point that I think I raised earlier under the strategic planning issue, that there aren't details about how infrastructure levy will be able to be coordinated strategically in the absence of a duty to cooperate. So in terms of resources, the white paper does acknowledge that some reforms will require resourcing, and there will be a comprehensive resources and skills strategy produced by the government. So we will wait to see that. And we feel there's a number of areas which will really need to be developed in terms, our skills need to be developed in terms of digital planning, net zero carbon and climate resilience, design and master planning, but others I'm quite sure as well. So there's an important, urgent need for local authorities to be properly resourced to implement these changes to the current planning system. And one final thing on the resources is that we feel that there aren't any proposals to set fees locally for planning applications, but we feel that that they will continue to be set nationally in the white paper. But we feel, for the reason set out in paragraph 48, that because brownfield urban sites, for example, in the city, require far greater resources than, say, dealing with planning applications on greenfield sites, and they often drive smaller local fees. So we would argue for the ability to set fees locally. Okay, do you want me to, is it okay just to move on to the other consultation, and then we can talk about everything at the end? Is that all right? Thanks. The second consultation is the changes of the current planning system consultation, and the first element of that is the revised methodology for assessing housing need. The aims of that methodology are to increase the delivery of planning of new homes, rather, to 300,000 new homes annually. And as you will no doubt remember, this method has already been changed once, and even under the current revision to that method, the number of the housing delivery hasn't increased to that level. So the method is set out in paragraph 51, and that basically involves setting a baseline by blending housing stock and housing projections in an effort to sort of stabilize, I think, the actual outputs of this method, because previously the method was based just on household projections, not on existing housing stock. And the second step is to adjust the baseline by taking account of market signals, including affordability data. So the planning white paper, as I mentioned earlier, it proposes that this standard method would generate a local housing need figure, which will then be the starting point for the housing requirement that will be set in local plans, and that will be adjusted, taking into account various constraints and nationally set sort of an approach to this this adjustment, which would then become a binding figure on local authorities. So the impact of this new revised method has been a huge variation in housing need across the country and locally. I've set out in Appendix 1 to the report, which is on page 43, how that has affected the east of England. That table shows, just for a bit of wider context. And so you can see for Norfolk, roughly halfway down the page, the increase in housing need is about 45% overall. And there's a lot of fluctuation within Norfolk itself in terms of the increases. In Norwich, it's gone down by 16%, which we would consider, that's sort of counterintuitive in terms of housing need. For South Norfolk, it's more than doubled. And for Greater Norwich as a whole, the 3 districts, it's gone up by about 60%, I think. Sorry, I've got it. Oh yes, it says it in paragraph 52. It's gone up by 60%. And the table that's set out under paragraph 52 shows the breakdown, the increase on that. Those are per annum figures. Under the current methodology, the per annum need for Greater Norwich is over 2,000 units, and it's gone up to over 3,200 units. So that's a huge increase. And we're going to hear in a few minutes actually about the Greater Norwich local plan, but obviously that's had a major implication for the Greater Norwich local plan in relation to the number of units of housing it will have to deliver. So we'll hear more about that in a few minutes, but it has major implications for that plan and also for other plans, no doubt, across the country. And we feel that the figures that are shown, the fluctuation in the figures doesn't assist coherent strategic planning, and it in relation to the urban area, the methodology calculates a level of need that's considerably low our previous assessments of housing needs. So something to note is that the revised method doesn't really take account of local circumstances or our ambitions for growth, for example. And obviously we've got a city deal for Norwich and Greater Norwich, but that's not really reflected in the figures. And it's just worth making the point as well, for those areas with increased housing requirements, local authorities will also have to address the implications for additional infrastructure needs as well, transport and community infrastructure, and potential impacts on the environment as well. And it's just worth noting that I'm sure you're aware that there's been an awful lot of discussion in the planning press, but also in the national press about the revised target figures, and there have been some indications that there will be a further, that this will change, that the method will possibly change. So I think today is the deadline for comments. We expect that it'll probably be a couple of months before the government publishes the response to that consultation. So probably about December, and then we'll have a better idea of what might be happening going forward. But there is an indication that this is adding to uncertainty for local authorities, and that in various parts of the country, I think a lot of MPs are sort of lobbying for a change to this method. So we'll have to wait and see what happens on that. Moving on to the first homes element of this second consultation. This is first homes we had a report, I think it went to SD panel earlier in the year about first homes at consultation earlier on in the year, which is seeking to introduce a new form of discounted market housing for first time buyers. The current consultation is proposing that 25% of all affordable housing secured will be for first homes, which will be sold at a discount of 30% to local first time buyers, and that first homes will take priority over other affordable tenures. So this 25% requirement, although it's lower than was mentioned in the earlier consultation earlier this year, which was the lowest, was 30% in that consultation, it still doesn't take account of local circumstances such as local affordability and the need in a particular area. So it raises the concern that we'll, as a local authority, lose control over the type of affordable housing delivered in our area, and reduce our ability to meet our local housing needs. And it may, in the case of Norwich, for example, effectively displace other affordable tenures such as affordable rent, which is our sort of predominant need. as set out in paragraph 58 of the report. So, and paragraph 59 is just saying that it's just providing a bit of information about our ambitious plans for housing delivery and plans for affordability of affordable housing delivery. So we don't want to undermine that. We would not wish for these proposals to undermine our ability to deliver affordable housing. The third element of this consultation is increasing the threshold for delivery of affordable housing on sites, as I mentioned, up to either 40 or 50, a threshold of 40 or 50 units. This is a temporary proposal and for 18 months, and it will be reviewed after that. And the purpose of it is to assist smaller scale, the economic recovery by assisting smaller developers, I think, to be able to deliver smaller sites. This is going to have major impacts on delivery of affordable homes and first homes. The consultation document itself acknowledges that there will be a reduction in affordable housing delivery. In Norwich, we've done a little bit of a calculation and shown that in the last sort of 7 or 8 years, as it says in paragraph 62, we've had, in sites of 40 plus units have delivered a third. So a third of our affordable homes were delivered in sites below 40 units. So sorry. So that's a substantial amount of affordable housing we would likely to be foregoing if these proposals come forward. Finally, the removal of the restriction to allow for permission in principle to be applied to major development. Permission in principle is equivalent to outline planning consent, and it establishes the acceptability of development in principle. And it means that more sites would be able to benefit from permission in principle, so that they wouldn't have to go through they wouldn't go through the normal planning process essentially. And there's concern, we have concern that the technical detail stage of a planning and permission in principle is more limited than that for a normal planning application. So there could be harm arising from that, from development. And also there's a concern about reduction in planning fees for councils. So then overall, the conclusion to the report as a whole is that these proposals are coming forward at a time when we've got sort of unprecedented uncertainty and instability in the economy overall. And there are some issues that might have some merit, but overall the council's concerned that of the impact of these proposals in a number of areas, and they're outlined at paragraph 68. So we don't support most of the proposals in the consultation papers that are noted above. We consider that they would undermine the ability of local authorities to produce plans that would respond effectively to local need. They would reduce or threaten a delivery of affordable housing, curtail local democracy, and impact on effective stakeholder engagement in the planning process. And they also have implications for effective cross-boundary working on strategic planning issues. And at the end of the day, there's no guarantee either that they will deliver the required new houses that the government is aiming for. And they may indeed give rise to greater uncertainty in relation to housing need. That's it.
Thank you, Judith. That was a really good comprehensive canter through what is a really complex and interrelated set of proposals from the government. So I'll take questions, obviously, for Judith. So there's any points of clarification that people have, so we can ensure people are happy that they fully understand the proposals. Then once we've done that, we'll move on to the council's response. And in terms of how we handle that, I'll suggest that we concentrate on if there's any elements that members disagree with or dispute, and also if there are any areas that members think have been left out or need to be strengthened. I think that's probably a good structure for handling that, just to make sure we've got some structure, because it is complex and we could have quite a disparate discussion. So just to try and keep some focus to it. So questions, please. And I can see Councillor Davies.
Thank you, Judith. That was a really good tour of what's going on. So I have a question. I imagine I'm a developer and I have secured some land in a growth zone. I know that I have to build over 40 units to have to put any affordable housing on. So I put in to build 39 units, and I know that I will not be paying infrastructure levy until completion. So I build 38 units. If that's replicated across the country, there will be no affordable housing built and no infrastructure levy paid. So surely there are massive loopholes all over this that are extremely obvious, even at this stage.
Yeah, certainly in terms of the threshold, it's likely to mean that sites will be, slightly larger sites won't be brought forward as quickly. I suppose sites are substantially larger, that won't necessarily affect them at all. But I think it's going to have some implications on people bringing forward sites that are around about the threshold level, definitely, and encouraging it on smaller sites. That's true. And the infrastructure levy is definitely going to have an impact payable at the end of the process. Yeah, I mean, there are potential loopholes. I think all I can say is that we don't have an awful lot of detail yet as to how that is going to work. Yeah. So is there something you would particularly want to flag up then in the response about the need for further detail on, particularly on the infrastructure levy? I think we have flagged that up, that there is a lack of detail, but we can maybe be a bit more specific about that.
Yeah, I just think that, this is, I mean, I know what I'd be doing if I had a few parcels of land lying around and wanted to make some money quickly. I certainly wouldn't be building over 40 units, and I certainly wouldn't be finishing my development. So I think that's a very obvious error in this that we should be flagging up, because I can just see no affordable housing being built and no infrastructure levy being paid.
That's Karen, that's presupposing it is an error, but you're right that we should absolutely point that out and strengthen that section, be a bit more specific. Is that generally agreed? Yeah, nods all round. Brilliant.
Mike, can I just comment? There's one of those two things that Councillor Davis mentions is a very real issue, which is the threshold of 40. Certainly back when I started here, we were working on a local plan that had a threshold of 25 units for affordable housing, and we got an awful lot of applications in for 24 dwellings on sites, some of them at quite low density, and in practice there was very little we could do about it. So you would anticipate that whatever the threshold they get, 39 units, you will get a remarkable number of applications for moving forward. As Judith mentioned, in terms of the infrastructure levy proposal, I think it's, as I understand it, and she's right that there isn't the detail there, it's going to be as properties are effectively sold. So as I think it would be a surprising loophole if the government allowed it for 38 dwellings on a 39 dwelling thing to be sold and not have that, whatever the infrastructure levy, to be captured. And I'm sure that runs across the sort of stated purpose of introducing the infrastructure levy. So the second issue that you flag up I would hope and imagine would be very easy for the government to close off during the detail of it. But the first thing is a very genuine risk.
I mean, thanks, Gran, that's helpful. And of course, notwithstanding that, I think those are two issues we would want to raise nonetheless, in particular, because we'd like to see the government close off the second infrastructure levy element at the more detailed stage. So thank you for that clarification. I can see Martin and then Kevin.
Yes, thank you very much, Mike. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions about paragraph 15 and the infrastructure levy. And apologies if I have misunderstood this. So maybe Judith, you can clarify this. So is it proposed that the government are going to basically charge this money and then give it back to local authorities, or is it still going to be collected at a local level? That's my first question. My second question is more a concern about the flat rate charge across the UK, because obviously what I think would be quite useful going forward is obviously allowing local authorities, or at least groups of local authorities, to set their own rates, rather than having this on this flat rate. I've got concerns about that, because actually, if it is set at such a rate, it will encourage development in the southeast and around London, basically, where you've got greater profitability potentially, rather than in more deprived areas. Then, in terms of the increased flexibility for how the local levy is spent, what I quite like about the SIL money at the moment is that it's basically meant to offset some of the issues that development inevitably causes. So it's for play areas or junctions or whatever it might be, and I think that's really useful. Actually, allowing local authorities to use it to basically make up deficits elsewhere, I think it could be me being a bit cynical, looking at ways for the government to basically realizing that there's going to be a major problem in local government funding and seeking ways to offset that. And actually, it's local residents who are affected by development perhaps bearing the greatest load there. And finally, my concern is against borrowing against the new levy. Maybe you could give some more details about the sort of numbers involved. How can local authorities plan against that, when at the one hand the government is saying we're not allowed to borrow against other things, and suddenly we're allowed to borrow against this potential pot? So could you maybe give a bit more clarification of those things, please?
I'll try to. Under the circumstances, there's not a lot of detail, but in terms of the first one was about collecting at local level, I think, and my understanding is yes, it would be collected at a local level, but I'm just trying to quickly look at go back to the actual document, and I can't reasonably find that very quickly, but I understand that it will be, although it will be a national flat rate set nationally, that the actual collection will take place locally. Yeah, that's my understanding.
That's correct, Judith.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you. And yeah, so I mean, you're saying you're concerned about the fact there's a flat rate. That is a concern, definitely. As I said, it's meant to be reflect the based on a final value of development above a minimum viability threshold. So I don't know how that would work in practice. Again, how that'll actually work. But it's so the devil is in the detail, really. But as I said in the sort of presentation, that might hit some parts of the country much more differently, than others, and so lower value areas will raise a lot less infrastructure levy, it would appear. So that is a concern that I have brought out in the actual response. I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow the point. That this third point was about flexibility, was it, in terms of what can be included in the infrastructure levy?
That's right. I mean, one of the things as I understand it, is that obviously we pool our SIL money, for example, and then sort of big or larger infrastructure projects like junction renewal and things like that can then be done. And I think that's a really positive spend of the money, because it means that local areas, ideally, who are affected by new developments, especially large scale developments, have some of that offset. And to have that money in effect, given the flexibility to spend it, I mean, how flexible is that going to be in terms of what can local councils spend it on? Can it be spent on just any capital project, for example, or is there some kind of sort of metric or some kind of parameters on which this money can be spent? That was my third question, and then about the borrowing against the levy was my last question.
I think that level of detail simply isn't in the consultation as yet. The only thing that I picked up from the consultation where the government were clear is they wanted to give increased flexibility to local authorities about how to spend it currently, what you can spend the community infrastructure levy on is very closely prescribed by both the legislation and the process that they may then make you go through to avoid this, what they described as double dipping, where you might be able to seek stuff through a Section 106 agreement and seek stuff through the community infrastructure levy. At the moment, there's a strict divide between those two things and no crossover. The example that they give in the consultation paper is about affordable housing, and if I go back a few years to when they introduced the community infrastructure levy, one of our comments that we made at the time was that the impact of the community infrastructure levy would effectively prioritise other infrastructure over affordable housing, and that's how it's worked out. And so one of the potential upsides of what is being proposed is actually it would put affordable housing on a level playing field with other infrastructure in terms of delivery. So that actually is sort of a change that's proposed that was certainly in accordance with the previous representations that the City Council made when SIL was introduced. But of course, it does raise an issue of you're making decisions about how to spend a pot of money. Affordable housing meets a certain level of needs, but has clearly a shared infrastructure demand itself. So you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you were, of course, providing affordable housing, but you weren't able to put in place the schools to educate the kids that are in the houses, etc., or provide for the physical access things. So you would have to take a sort of balanced approach to it. But I think, through the procedures we've got in place, you would normally expect us to be able to do so. On your point about the future funding of it, we're, as you know, we're somewhat unique in the country because we not only pool our SIL, but that then relates to the city deal, and through that procedure, we uniquely in the country have the ability already to borrow via the city deal against future SIL incomes. So that's probably a change that's less dramatic for Greater Norwich than it is for just about any other part of the country, where most across everywhere else I'm aware of, effectively SIL needs to be come in. There's a lag as development happens, and it can only be spent once the SIL has arisen, because there's the government, when they introduced it, were very keen to keep the pressure off the accounts and the public sector borrowing deficit there. So that change is less significant for us about forward funding, but the city deal gives access to a discounted rate of borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board. So there's a relative surety about what you're going to be paying for borrowing that money and the long-term nature of it. So the risks of borrowing in advance are low. We don't know what the arrangements are going to be for any future borrowing, because clearly development rates and therefore the amount of money that you will get in will fluctuate quite wildly over the years, and it'll be for them to your sort of treasury management approach about what level of risk you are prepared to take as a local authority. I think my instinct would be that might be a few places that would be pushing it somewhat, because there will be a lot of pressure to use that borrowing to deliver infrastructure. It can be very expensive. You might find somewhere that considerable debt's being run up by local authorities, which pose a potential financial risk at a time when many local authorities are already under considerable pressure financially.
Thanks, Graham.
Sorry, can I just say I found the reference to borrowing, and it's only one short paragraph in the planning white paper, and it just says that to better support the timely delivery of infrastructure, we would allow local authorities to borrow against infrastructure levy revenues to forward fund infrastructure. And this basically, there's no information at all about the detail of that, but it's on page 62 of the white paper if anybody wants to look at that.
I think we need to be aware that the white paper is very light on detail, and we need to be pointing that out, but not speculating about what might or might not happen too much, because actually we don't know, and we're not going to know until we get more detail. But I think that the points made are very valid, and we do say in our proposed response that there's a lack of detail, and we could perhaps add this to as an example to that section, if that would help. Martin? Yes? Yep. Okay, good. Kevin, and then Judith.
Okay, first of all, Judith, thanks once again. You've taken a whole chunk of detail and made it understandable. I really appreciate that, because planning, yeah, the devil is in the detail. What I'd like, it's a question and a comment. I'll try and keep my comment short, but it's that relationship. Alarm bells ring for me when it talks about design codes. And I'd like to know, am I, catastrophizing? Because I immediately think, especially when you put scare quotes around beauty, and you think the polarity of that, I guess, is carbuncle. And there's that relationship between design and technology. New technologies come in and radicalize design incredibly. If you go back 700-800 years, and that very radical perpendicular Gothic style of architecture, would that have been denied because it didn't fit the design code? Or when Selfridges was built at the turn of the last century, and the new technologies that allowed greater spans and gave us the department store, would that be banned if this was now in place? And I'm just wondering, slightly more recently, UEA Ziggurat, would we have thrown our hands up in horror and said, no, there's no way they comply with our design codes? There must be room for innovation. And I'm not just thinking about visual and function, but in particular in relation to sustainability. One of the great advances that we're seeing in design and technology are the ways in which we can future-proof our buildings and reduce their carbon footprint. These can all affect design. Now, my imagination might be on overdrive there, but how do you see this idea of a design code working? It does sound it's going to lock things down and stop innovation. I'd like your views on that, please.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's so incredibly subjective, what is good design, really. And that's why we've made the point about any design codes will need to be very context specific. But yes, I think it's a really good point you've made about, flagging up the need for addressing innovation in design as well. But I think they're going to be used to particularly say to sit alongside the local plan to inform what is appropriate in terms of design for, say, allocated sites, new allocations in growth areas, for example. So as I said, the proposals include master plans and design codes for sites in growth areas. I'm not clear whether you'd have an overarching design code, or you'd have I think you would have to have that, and then maybe individual design codes for sites. So that, I think that has implications for if you have those agreed at a stage in the plan making process, and then how much flexibility is there later on when you get to a detailed stage of planning application on a site that's in a growth zone. Then is there not much scope for reviewing that, the design code? It seems that if they're set at a certain point in the process, that could be too restrictive, really. So I think I've made that point in there in somewhere, but it might be something that could be further pulled out. But certainly the innovation point, I think, is a really good one.
If we want to give an example about innovation and the risk of design codes, instead of mentioning some of the things that Councillor Maguire mentioned, we could always cite the example of Goldsmith Street. Clearly, more recent, got Sterling Prize award-winning development that actually, if you just took a basic residential design guide approach to it, certain aspects of that scheme may not normally comply with typical suburban residential design guides. So some of the distances involved from sort of window to window at the rear of them were specifically designed around orientation and sunlight levels because of the sort of passive nature and the solar passive nature of the Goldsmith Street development. The danger is, I think, with a straightforward design guide, you can reduce the scope for innovation and response to particular local circumstances. So, you know, a typical suburban design guide, for instance, if you look at the famous ones that Essex County Council produced in the 1980s, she's frequently held up as one of the best examples of a design guide. Goldsmith Street didn't get close to hitting the standards within that development, but within that design guide, but actually has delivered a marvelous place that delivers great quality housing at high densities in an urban area. So it's potentially a real challenge.
So, and again, I think we could be, when we make that point in the response, which I presume we're happy to do, we could give that as an example just to strengthen it. You happy with that? Good, good, good. Thank you. Judith.
Yes, thank you, Chair. There is a lot to worry about in this white paper, but I'll just restrict my comments to our response in paragraphs 25 and 26. And the white paper proposes to abolish the duty to cooperate. Now, this certainly will affect Norwich, and I would think a lot of other cities that where their urban boundary is shared with other local authorities. There's a great opportunity for some, when you don't have like-minded local authorities doing their own thing. And yes, the example of out-of-town shopping centres makes it very clear. But I wonder just whether or not we could illustrate Norwich by saying that our urban boundaries are shared by, South Norfolk, Broadland, and give a clearer example of how, decisions made by those other authorities can greatly affect the viability and sustainability of Norwich. And I know you give the example of sort of Norfolk as a whole and how we cooperate over housing. But I think, you would think that these people making these, looking at the consultation responses would understand how local authority boundaries do merge in the urban areas. But I just wonder whether it's worth making it clearer that Norwich does have these boundaries with other local authorities in our urban areas.
Yes,
and I think, we've done a difficult job. We've done a good job under difficult circumstances to cooperate, and what a shame that we've got this far, that we might, it might all be in jeopardy, and we're turning the clock back to a situation where local authorities do their own thing and resources are wasted and there's no sustainability in what we're doing. It's a very retrograde step, but other than trying to emphasize that response to them, I don't know what else one can do, really.
Thank you, Judith. I saw while you were talking, I saw Ian and Karen put their hands up. Was that on this point? Did you want to add something in before there's a response? No, it's on different issues. Okay. I saw Denise. Was that on this point or is it on a different point? It's on this point. Okay, I'll bring you in now, Denise, before... You'll need to unmute though. Denise, you need to unmute.
Yes, to support Judith strongly on this point, I think the loss of strategic planning is one of the most serious issues. We lost structure plans, which I think were the best way of strategic planning. We went to regional plans, we lost those. We're on duty to cooperate. To lose duty to cooperate with no other strategic planning measures in place is a disaster in my view, because it would lead to competition between authorities, and particularly serious in Norwich. Norwich city centre, I think, could be undermined by out of town developments, and they will be they'll be car based, and so I think we've got I see a planning free for all around the edge of Norwich, especially given that the new planning methodology and the logarithms are going to lead to, well, a doubling of housing in South Norfolk, potentially, and an increase in Broadland, a drop in Norwich. So, yes, I've got serious.
Denise. You've got a question.
Well, yes, to strengthen. I don't know if it's we're on to comment section now, but to strengthen the section on loss of strategic planning and what that means for Norwich, what it means for cities, because the white paper is very much, as Judith says, directed towards large developments on greenfield sites, as I see it. Can I raise a couple of other questions here, please, Mike?
Tell you what, we'll take a response on the original point, which hopefully will be that we'll strengthen our response. And then before you, Denise, I also saw Ian and Karen put their hands up. So I'll go Ian, Denise, and then Karen, because Karen's spoken once already. So Judith, did you want to respond? That's Judith Davison.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, that's absolutely fine. I think we can strengthen that response that's set out in the report in paragraphs 25 and 26 to reflect more specific issues to Norwich, just to generally strengthen that. Yeah, that's fine. Happy
Brilliant.
to do that.
Okay, so Ian.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Judith, for the comprehensive report. I'd like to talk about the local democracy and consultation, which is on page 34. This is a real concern, because it appears to me that not only do we have to have a level of detail in the local plan that covers projects, local people will only have an early opportunity to feed in on those. That's a real concern, and it's all. I mean, it looks like a trick to me, because in the early stages there can't possibly be enough detail to cover it, and then if developments are being pushed through a final stage just on design codes, the feedback we'll get from the public will be at that late stage, and it'll already be too late. Is that correct?
Yes. So you're saying about the early engagement. Yes, it means that there'll be less engagement. The proposals are that there'll be less engagement in the planning application process when the principle of development has already been established.
Thank you. Yes, and will we also effectively lose our planning committees?
Well, that seems to be the implication. They're not, certainly under the proposals, they wouldn't work in the same way as they do at the moment, because for a start, there'd be probably less applications going to planning committee, because various like sites would get deemed consent under the allocation process in a growth area, for example. And as I say in paragraph 28, there's no detail about how neighbours and other interested parties can be involved in the process. So there's definitely less of a role for councillors in terms of deciding planning applications and making sure that there's public engagement at that stage. So it has got serious implications. But again, you know, I think there's not really much detail in the document, but it's the implications coming out of what it suggests that seem to be quite serious.
Okay, thank you. But again, that's something which that's the point that we are making in our proposed response, isn't it? So
yeah.
Hopefully we're content with that. So who? Yes, Denise.
Thanks, Mike. I wanted to, of two questions, please, Judith. Rural areas, how, in a very rural area, in a village, for example, they might want to build 10 houses, a couple of which were affordable. How are rural areas going to achieve affordable housing in future without building large extensions? And secondly, the zoning, although there's no detail in the consultation about zoning, I wonder if Whitehall civil servants have given any clue about zoning, whether, well, how it's going to be undertaken, whether the whole country is going to be zoned, the size of the zones, the boundaries of zones, whether we're going to have a mixture of very large zones and small zones, what the parts of the built-up area in Norwich, for example, Nelson, which I represent, how that might be zoned, whether it would be a protected area or what. A lot of, so yeah, thank you, Jude. Lots of questions.
Okay, well, I'll try and sorry. On the, you asked about affordable housing in rural areas. Well, obviously that's going to be impacted by the threshold issue on, you know, the raising of the threshold. So I think it will inevitably be impacted, but and perhaps that the main focus for providing affordable housing will be on those larger sites, much larger sites. I mean, in rural areas, I may be, it's a while since I've worked in one, but there's, you know, exceptions policies in relation to bringing forward sites in rural areas. I think it still applies. So there may be other routes to that. In terms of the zoning, I've just been looking again at the proposals in this white paper, and there's very little detail other than those 3 zones. And we've raised concerns in the response that it's very difficult to see how you would zone, say, for example, the city centre, how that, you know, it's mostly a conservation area, but yet it's the focus of growth for the regional economy. How do we deal with that? We don't have that detail, actually. But it says, I'm just having a little look here. It talks about things like, in growth areas, we would want to allow sub areas for self and custom built homes and community-led housing developments. But you know, that's one small aspect, really. It doesn't provide any detail really other than what's in the white paper. But they are seeking alternative options on, rather than dividing land into 3 categories, we're interested in views on more binary models. One option would be to combine growth and renewal areas into 1 category. But anyway, so you'd only have 2 zones. But as I say, there's very, very little guidance and sort of assessment of what the advantages or disadvantages there would be of the options. So I'm sorry, it's not a very detailed answer, I'm afraid.
Well, I think, you know, it's not your fault, Judith. That the fault lies with the lack of detail that we've been provided with, and again, that's a point that we're going to make back to government a number of times, I suspect, when we're looking at different aspects of this. I saw
just to answer Councillor Carlo's point, my understanding of the white paper was that those 3 areas that were defined in it, the task given to local authorities would be to include all of their areas in one of those 3 categories. So there would be nowhere that wasn't within growth, renewal, or protection.
Okay. Thanks. Right, so I've got Karen briefly, because some people haven't spoken yet. Then I saw Adam, then I saw Marion. So yeah. Karen, you want to go first?
This is kind of what Denise and Judith have been saying, but with a few more questions. So this is about the zoning and the duty to cooperate. So in the city centre, we will clearly have all 3 zones. So I don't quite know how that's going to work on a street by street basis. I've no idea how that can work, and obviously we don't have enough detail to know that either. So Judith's covered that. But also, if we lose the duty to cooperate, what's going to happen about our our cooperation between building on regeneration sites on brownfield and on greenfield sites, because clearly in Norwich we have very small areas of land for development. We have very, very small land that's available for development, and clearly Norwich, South Norfolk and Broadland have huge swathes of land. So everything we've been doing basically in our planning up to now, where we're trying to keep the house building in the city areas, so that we have the infrastructure, we have the schools, we have the healthcare. Surely now this is just going to be spread out and we are going to create those kind of village clusters that we all know are not going to work or be sustainable.
Yeah.
Yes. So your
The
first
answer to
point,
that is yes, isn't it?
on that first point, I think you're just sort of underlining your concern about the operation of the zoning system and the fact that we don't know how that's going to work in the city centre, particularly, which is that's fine, and can maybe try and bring that out a little bit more in the response. But definitely the loss of the duty to cooperate will impact on the ability to achieve sustainable development, because it may lead to much more development on greenfield sites and less on brownfield sites because of that lack of cross-border cooperation. And that's maybe something, if it's not already mentioned in here, I could bring that out a bit, the impact on achieving sustainable development. So I definitely take that point.
Okay, so we've got Adam and then Marion.
Thank you, Chair. A comment really, but as I haven't spoken on this item, to thank Judith for the comprehensive report she's provided and the response to the consultation. I think it summarises very well our objections. The government have created a significant housing crisis over the past decade. And I think what we've got here is a typical example of what they do in Whitehall when there's a problem. Carry out an unnecessary, undesirable top-down reorganisation with no consultation with those on the ground to make it look like they're doing something about a problem that they really know nothing about. Perhaps controversially, and I probably shouldn't say this, but as I am a politician, I'm sure it has nothing to do with the £11 million in donations that the Tories have received from developers over the last 12 months since Boris Johnson became leader.
Thank you, Adam. Marion. Marion, I think you might have frozen. Oh, are you okay? But you need to unmute as well, Marion.
I can't.
Yeah.
I can't get. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Sorry, having problem unmuting, and I don't know if you can see me.
Yes, we can.
Right. What I'm really a bit worried about is the impact on highways. If they start to give us all sorts of different areas that are outside in the greenfield sites and around the villages and places like that, what will the cost? Who will be carrying the cost of putting in a highway to it?
Sorry. Sorry, what exactly, could just clarify that point? Do you mean sort of more generally?
About the infrastructure levy being previously used
to
fund highways.
Fair enough. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I mean, there is a issue raised in the report. It doesn't specifically mention highways actually, but it's just an issue about the need for strategic coordination of infrastructure spending. When we bring in the infrastructure levy, at the moment with SIL, we obviously have a structure across Greater Norwich for spending that and making decisions on spending the SIL money that we have. But with infrastructure levy and lack of a strategic planning cross-border sort of a structure, there is a big question mark about how we will coordinate strategic infrastructure investment. And I have think that is referenced under the infrastructure levy, paragraph 46 in the report. I could sort of maybe, you know, say flag up, for example, highways infrastructure, something like that, just to beef it up a little bit further, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So we've taken a good few questions and we've noted a lot of areas that we want to strengthen. Are we coming close to agreeing the response? Yeah, I can see. Ian, did you want to say one more thing? And then Denise. Ian.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to emphasise one of the biggest issues, and that is the proposal for 40 plus units to be in the threshold for social housing, affordable housing. It's a really key point in 62, and I know Judith's gone over it, but I think it's worth emphasising the fact that so many of our properties in Norwich that are for affordable rental or affordable housing come from these smaller sites. So I think that's something that needs strengthening, the emphasis on that. So I'd like that to stay at 10 if it's possible.
Okay, fine. Denise?
In the overall conclusions, I think that Judith's too kind when she says, although some aspects of the proposals have merit, because I think we should start off by saying that overall the paper will have a negative impact. And my own view, and obviously it can't be included, is that the white paper will smash up the planning system, and it's coming from a basis of complete ignorance about the planning system. God knows who's written it in Whitehall. It strikes me it's been written by 20-year-olds who know nothing about the planning system, know nothing about delivery of housing. So yes, I agree that our overall conclusion, but I'd rather like to see the benefits downplayed, because I think the benefits are very minor. I think that the benefits are probably the digital aspects and also some design aspects, but those are minor. Sorry?
That's absolutely fine.
I think, Denise, I think what I'm hearing you say is it's actually about the order in which we do it.
Yeah.
We start off by saying that we're very critical of the proposals overall. And then later on, almost grudgingly, maybe not grudgingly, but acknowledge that there are some minor points.
Yes.
But I think it's important to say also that those minor points that might be beneficial are hugely insignificant compared to the overall negative consequences of the proposals.
Yeah,
I think that's the way we would couch it. And of course, we wouldn't. It's always important to be seen to be balanced, or to be able to say, well, yes, we can see some good points. So you're not rubbishing it all. I think you get more credibility if you do that. So I think that's probably the way we need to do it. And as you say, downplay it, but then be a lot stronger on the negative consequences. I'm seeing lots of heads nodding.
Can I make a suggestion on how you manage the mechanics of that, Mike?
Go on.
Because the conclusion that Councillor Carlo comments on, I'm not sure we will sort of effectively submit, because that's an overall conclusion covering two responses, one of which is the more technical response that needs to go in later today, and the other one is on the white paper that needs obviously to go on through to Cabinet and be agreed at Cabinet before final submission. And on that sort of overall reaction, when Council debated the motion related to this the other week, it agreed that whatever the response was, I think it was down for the leader, and I wonder whether you as responsible portfolio holder may want to sign that letter as well. So it was whatever the response that was agreed was to be submitted with a covering letter. I think the covering letter to I think the motion specified who it was to be written to, probably ought to encompass that overall response that goes in politically, which clearly there's a degree of consensus from the panel about whether this is a welcome change to the planning system, and clearly the view is that it isn't. So if you capture that overall conclusion in that covering letter, it's probably the smarter way of doing it, I think.
Okay, that's fine, Graham. I think we can do that. I'm just seeing 3 hands go up. So Adam, then Karen, then Ian.
Thank you, Chair. On a rather less political point than I last made, I think I'd like to see us commenting on the fact that these proposals don't do anything to address the issue of land banking. The amount of homes across the country that have been granted planning permission by local authorities, but are being sat on by developers who are speculating for when the property prices are just right for them. I think that's the real blockage in the system, and I'd like to see us make reference to that in our consultation response, if that's suitable. Thanks.
Sorry, could I've dropped out of the thing for a second there. You see, you were just talking about the issue of land banking there. Was there anything else that I missed?
No, just to identify that that's the real blockage in the system that's preventing sufficient homes being built.
That's fine. I do make a reference to it, but I can beef that up a little bit. Yeah.
It's paragraph 42 in the officer report, which picks up that particular issue, but certainly I think they could probably do with being strengthening, because it is a noticeable omission from the proposals that, tackling where we've seen landowners sit on sites with the benefit of consent and not do anything because they're waiting for land values to change is a significant issue that the white paper absolutely doesn't bring forward any measures to address. It thinks that automatically, if people get a right to develop, a development will follow, and our experience of having granted considerable consents or having considerable freedoms built into the planning system doesn't necessarily follow that development will follow on there from there.
Right, okay, so everyone's moved around on the screen. Ian, Karen. It's Karen, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks. This is on the political response, so on the letter that will be sent on the white paper, as well as you and Alan signing it, Mike. I think actually this should be signed by the leaders of all parties on the City Council, because this is something we're all in agreement. This is an attempt to break up the planning system. This is an attempt to strip local authorities of any power, and this is an attempt to stop residents having any say or any consultation on what's directly affecting their lives. So I think this response should go from all parties to Robert Jenrick.
That's a recommendation we can make. We're in agreement with that, to make it as a recommendation. We can't make the decision, but it's a recommendation, and presumably given that the council full council decision was different to that, but if all 3 leaders agreed to that, then I'm assuming we'd be able to do it. Okay. Was there anybody else? Ian.
Thank you. Yeah, just a final thing on the permission in principle. I just wondered if officers agree that this appears to be another opportunity for developers, for the permission in principle on larger developments, to avoid and bypass the local scrutiny from members and the public system. And I wondered also if the proposal to allow more than one developer to work on sites is another potential loophole for the 40 sites plus system, because a developer working on a part of a site might consider that if they're working on 39 of the properties, they won't be liable for the new levy.
I don't. I mean, it's something we can bring up. I didn't think that. I think that, you know, that wouldn't be the intention, but it's probably worthwhile sort of the one about the 40 units threshold being a potential loophole. It's probably worth making that point, that we don't want to see that happening. So yeah, certainly can add that. Okay.
Were there any other comments? No. So Judith, that's Judith 1 or Judith 2. Judith Davison. You've got enough to go on to amend the response in accordance with the discussion we've had, and then to be able to submit.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
That's fine, thank you. Are you happy for me then, because I've got to submit the second of the 2 consultation responses today, so are you happy for me to send that off and make those changes and just send it off? Maybe, does anybody else need to see it? I'll have to get, you know, I need to make quite a few changes to it, so.
You know, I'm happy to look at it before it goes. I'm in the duty to cooperate forum from 1:45, but that could be quite long today, but
yeah.
given everything else going on, and given everything else going on, but I will, you can send it to me and I'll try and look at it while I'm in the meeting.
Yes, okay. Right.
Okay.
What I suggest we do is clearly get a response in within the time frame that we've been given. If for some reason, which I'll sign off today if you're happy with this, Mike, if on reflection you wish to augment it or change it in any way, I think it will be easier to do sending in a replacement or an update in the coming days. It's the way that tends to work best. What I would also suggest is that when we report through to Cabinet in a couple of weeks' time, we effectively would need to change the report. So we'll append the response that was sent to the detailed changes, and then focus the report for Cabinet on the response that it will be still proposed and being recommended to Cabinet following the debate at this panel today.
Fine, thank you.
Thank you.
Right, okay, we'll move on. So we've had an hour and 5 minutes on that, but it was complex, and clearly the debate has been helpful and members wanted to have it. I've just been talking offline to Kevin because I need to leave by 11, so he's going to take the chair at 11 as vice chair. Although I think he made the point he needs to be away by 11:30. So we're going to have to try and be efficient with our time, even though we started half an hour earlier. So let's which I think is the new normal now. It's good to start early, get it done, and then enjoy the rest of the day. Okay, so let's move on. The second item is the verbal update on the GNLP, and some interesting and welcome news in a sense, I think, Graham.
Okay, I'll just, in view of the time, I'll try and keep this fairly brief because members will be aware that there was a supplementary paper came round that related to the publication of the papers for the GNDP meeting. So hopefully you've all had a chance to read them. The debate took place yesterday morning, and I don't know if any of you tuned in to see it on the YouTube channel. I don't think it was a blockbuster, but it was quite interesting. Clearly the paper that was outlined, explained that actually the last time the panel, the Greater Norwich Development Partnership met, they'd agreed a revised timetable for the production of the Greater Norwich Local Plan, and the paper that was prepared explained that for a variety of reasons associated with where the white paper was and particularly the implications of the standard method that we've just discussed, there are actually significant risks in taking forward the Greater Norwich Local Plan to the only recently published timetable. And those, as much relate probably more to the scale of the change resulting from the new standard methodology as they do from the white paper itself, although the two things do relate, and there are, we still need to bear in mind that both of those things are still subject to consultation, and so they're only proposals, not definite things anyway. But the paper outlined 3 broad options for progressing the work on the local plan. The second option of those 3 was carry on as has previously been intended, and that option basically was considered to be the least tenable of the 3 options that could be identified, because of the fear that whilst the consultation, the numbers in the standard methodology are still draft, the experience from past government consultations on this is that they're not likely to change a huge amount, if at all, before they are finally published. And assuming that is the case, the local plan work has been based on an assessment of need that is very different from what the government would be suggesting now. Now, people will recall that one of the City Council's concerns about the emerging local plan is actually was undermet housing needs somewhat. It could have usefully increased it, but even from our work on housing needs, I don't think there's any way we could reasonably get to a quantification of the level of needs that result from the new methodology. And certainly the sites that have been proposed to date through the local plan would not allow effectively the authorities to bring forward a sound plan that identified that many homes for development. The scale of increase is potentially really quite significant and would require, allocations of a further 25,000 homes in order to meet those targets, which the work that we've done to date simply would not allow the Greater Norwich Development Partnership to do. So it puts us in really quite an uncomfortable position. And the 2 options that other than plough on regardless and hope that the common sense prevails and those numbers come down, the 2 options are basically to try, first one is to try and speed up the local planning process, dispense with the further consultation that was planned previously, and get to that Regulation 19 draft stage by early next year, to allow formal submission of the plan next summer, or the third option was frankly to abandon it and abandon the local plan and wait for the new planning system to kick in and prepare new style plans or whatever. Now, the paper that was prepared for the GNDP sets out the pros and cons of those different options, and comes down very strongly on the side of, well, in the circumstances we have little option but to expedite the plan process, because the main purpose of that plan is now to keep control of the planning system, to reduce this planning by appeal that would be associated with not having a plan in place to meet statutory deadlines, and so to expedite it to try and go for a plan prepared under the transitional arrangements, so meeting effectively currently identified levels of housing need, not the potentially significant larger need figures that are placed on us. That undoubtedly poses certain technical risks, and following the debate at the GNDP yesterday, the recommendations were agreed, but the members requested that a further meeting of the panel take place so they could run through some of those risks late October, early November, to satisfy themselves that they were doing the right option. That was basically the outcome. So the outcome was that recommendations were effectively accepted. The effort is going to be on now on expediting the production of a local plan, bringing forward additional evidence to address some of the risks that would be done in that, and alongside that, commencing a limited amount of work in relation to the proposals in the white paper, particularly around potential for new settlements in the light of the higher housing numbers that may be coming down the track for the area, but also on particularly digital planning and how we may effectively work together across the partnership to prepare ourselves to be take advantage of some of the new technologies about how we engage with communities and can model things on a 3D basis using all the data that may be available to us. So that was where we were. There was an interesting and full debate at the panel, I think I would describe it, but effectively there was a clear consensus reached across all of the councils that actually to effectively abandon plan making at this point would be the wrong response, and to expedite it if possible is the right one.
I think it's fair to say that at the meeting yesterday, the recommendations which we were supporting were approved, ultimately unanimously, although South Norfolk did express some reservations, but they were approved. So we were pleased to see that process going forward in that way for all the reasons that Graham has explained. Are there any questions on that from anybody? I think it's fairly clear. Clear as anything is at the moment. Denise.
You're on mute, Denise.
Okay, yes, 2 questions, please, Chair. Yes, Graham Fuller from South Norfolk said at the meeting yesterday that there were...
I mean John Fuller, by the way, Denise. Sorry.
Graham Fuller, please no.
John
He's
Fuller.
related, Graham.
Yeah. Sorry,
John
Graham.
Fuller, yeah.
John Fuller, yes, from South Norfolk Council said that there were 12 material reasons why the Regulation 18 plan was found to be unsound, and I just wondered if you're able to list those, please, Graham. My colleague listened to it, and he said that officials had referred to unsound reasons. And secondly, we're seeing climate change going completely out the window by the sound of it. There are concerns in January expressed by the City Council over lack of sustainability and implications for climate change in the plan as was. And so this is going to be an even greater problem now, especially if we're going to see new sites come forward, large housing developments on greenfield sites, and more village dispersal by the sounds of it.
Okay, I mean, thanks for the question. There's 2 points that you raised. Councillor Fuller's listing of the 12 points that he described it. He didn't actually go through what those individual points were at the meeting, but that was his interpretation of the paper that went through the panel in July that agreed why it was appropriate at that point to set the timetable back and do the further consultation that was proposed then. And that was, instead of trying to list out those 12 points now and respond to them, that was the reason the panel agreed the additional meeting that it set in late October, early November, to actually do more thorough consideration of it from an officer perspective. I think there's quite a lot of information in the report that went to the GNDP about some of those risks and how they are going to be managed and mitigated through the process. But clearly there's a further rationale about those reasons that relate back to the July report that needs to be produced. And so that'll have to wait for a, that subsequent meeting of the GNDP to have that discussion around it. And while I've been answering your first question, I apologise, I've forgotten the second. Can you remind me? Oh, I know, actually, it's come back to me. It was about the climate change issues and the danger of sort of unconstrained growth around it. In view that, the city council clearly had raised previous concerns about the sustainability and the level of growth that was proposed. Those are still need to be considered as part of moving the plan forward. So we don't have a revised plan on the table at the moment, a draft regulation 19 version. We're going to move forward at some pace to enable that to be considered, but that doesn't mean that those responses that either the public made or the councils made at those times aren't going to be considered. They still need to be considered, and so they will be moving forward. And so we'll have to wait and see what that comes up with before you sort of make a judgment about how successful those previous representations have been. But the wider point about climate change, I think, is that the impacts of having planned growth and a level of growth that is broadly consistent with where the local authorities see the levels of needs will have a much better relationship with the pressures arising from climate change than the alternative of not doing it, and that potentially being faced with local authorities collectively losing control of the planning system in the way that we have seen a few years ago, where you saw a large number of frankly speculative developments either come in and get approved on planning appeals outside of the local plan framework, or frankly approved by local councils because they realised they had no choice and would just simply face an award of costs if they tried to hold the line on the current preferred development options. So I don't think it necessary of the options that are available to the councils. I think I would argue that the option that is proposed and the councils are trying to work to deliver it is by far the preferable option from a number of angles, but including that angle if you look at it from the point of view of the pressures arising from climate change.
Okay, I saw Adam put his hand up during that.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with Graham. I think this is the least worst option. Obviously, we raised serious concerns before, and I still share those. But I think of the two options available, this is the least worst. Question I was going to ask Graham is how far advanced South Norfolk is now with its village clusters applications plan, and what the deadline that will be for publications. Obviously, they were much further behind Broadland on that last time we met in July.
The short answer is I don't know where they stand, but clearly as part of moving this process forward, we will need to work out where that stands, because it delivers a certain element, albeit a relatively minor element, of the overall growth that is required in the Greater Norwich local plan. So we will need to explain as part of this process whether that plan is continuing. My understanding is work at the moment is continuing on that plan, but I'm afraid I don't know where it stands in terms of timetable, but we will need to clarify that as we move into bringing forward the Regulation 19 version of the plan, because it would be part of the evidence base.
Thank you, Graham. So are there any other questions or comments on this item, the GNLP update? No. Thank you everyone for that. So we'll move on now to the Article 4 direction update. That's agenda item 4 originally on page 17 for those who may have got lost as we've rearranged the order of the agenda. Is this you, Judith?
It's me.
Brilliant. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Back in July, I presented a report to this panel to seek your views on the need for an Article 4 direction to remove permitted development rights for the conversion of offices to residential. Members voted unanimously in favour of recommending to Cabinet that the Council introduce a non-immediate Article 4 direction. So following the meeting, I drafted the direction, produced the maps and wrote the Cabinet report. However, just before the report was finalised, the government announced changes to both the use classes order and the general permitted development order, which impact upon the Article 4 direction. So these are kind of set out within my report. But in summary, on the 1st of September, new legislation took effect, which introduces 3 new use classes order. And these replace a number of the existing use classes. So one of the new use classes is Class E, which includes shops, financial and professional services, restaurants, cafes, B1A offices, gyms, healthcare, day nurseries and childcare. So basically this means that Class B1A no longer exists. So in terms of the Article 4 direction, the problem is that the relevant part of the General Permitted Development Order, which allows for offices to change use to residential without the need for full planning permission, so this is within Class O of the General Permitted Development Order, hasn't been updated yet. So it still refers to Class B1A. However, as Class B1A doesn't exist anymore, Class O effectively becomes meaningless. So there is a transition period which runs until the 31st of July next year. So developers can still change offices to residential without the need for planning permission. But as the transition period expires before our proposed Article 4 direction was due to come into force, and the reason for that is that we need to give the 12 months notice to avoid substantial compensation claims. It is not considered that we can withdraw office to residential conversion permitted development rights with an Article 4 direction until 12 months after the Class O replacement comes into effect. So it's therefore proposed that as soon as the new permitted development rights are announced, we bring a paper back to this panel and then we proceed as we were going to. So this is extremely regrettable. However, we have sought advice on this from both MP Law and the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government. And it's considered that this is the only way forward. So this delay is the only thing that we can do without being subject to substantial compensation claims. Thank you. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Joy. That was very clear and concise. Kevin is going to take over the chair now for the rest of this item so that we don't get halfway through the discussion and have to swap over then. So over to you, Kevin.
Right, thanks, Mike, and thanks for chairing so far. And appreciate some of your big brain operating at times to get 3 things running at once. So I can't do that, but I'll do my best. Okay, so let's go with my brain was slightly elsewhere. So let me just. So I can only get 9 at a time on my Joy. Can you just repeat what you're now saying the recommendation is, please?
Well, it's really just to note that there's going to be a delay in the introduction of the Article 4 direction, and I think that it's something that is beyond our control. It's given the advice that we've received from MP Law and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, it's simply not possible to introduce an Article 4 direction at this stage. So until we know what the what changes will be made to the general permitted development order, and they will need to be made by the 31st of July next year. Hopefully we'll know before that date what the changes are. There's no way that we can proceed with the introduction of the Article 4 direction.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarity. I thought that's what you said. So this is an item to note rather than to comment. So bearing in mind a comment that I've repeated before that was said about the US House of Congress, everything's been said, but not everybody's said it yet. Can you bear that in mind? We've got half an hour to go. And are there any comments on the noting of this item? Now, I'll have to swish between, if there are no hands up. So are we happy to note? Lovely. How wonderful. Thank you so much. Duly noted. So there is therefore one item left, if I read my agenda correctly, and this is the community involvement statement, which is a set of temporary arrangements in response to COVID. Who's going to take us through that?
Would you like me to, Judith? Yeah. So this article agenda item is asking you to endorse the changes. The statement of community involvement covers both the planning policy stage and the development management stage, and sets out how we as a council engage with the wider community. Obviously, the recent current COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic has impacted what we can do, and we have indeed made several changes already. So obviously this meeting is one of them. It's online, it's virtual, and there are other meetings that are going on in a similar fashion. So the amendments that we propose are simply to recognise the current restrictions and set out how we may adapt to them or change our method accordingly. The way in which we propose to do that is under current or fairly recent guidance set out in the National Planning Policy Guidance, that's saying that councils can make a temporary change to our statement of community involvement policies simply to respond to the government guidance on the pandemic, and we don't need to advertise it or consult more widely. It's something we can do internally, which is what we propose. Given as the many changes that you've just heard the government are proposing, this document may need to be changed quite significantly in the future, but clearly it's all a little bit uncertain at the moment. Anyway, we are obliged to make a more thorough update every 5 years, which would be next year, probably near the end of the year. So the changes that are proposed are temporary, with more thorough review proposed next year. So in my report, I've set out the main changes that we've made or we're proposing. The current SCI is set into 3 different sections: an introduction, a section on how we engage with planning policy documents, and a section on how we engage during the development management process. So in terms of the introduction, there is a change, an additional paragraph within the equality section, which recognises that unfortunately the more vulnerable groups may actually be at risk of being more significantly impacted by the government guidance than other groups, and where at all possible we will endeavour to reduce this impact and perhaps send out hard copies if necessary and sort of be flexible, basically. Within the same section, it acknowledges, as I briefly mentioned, that meetings including the planning meetings will be virtual rather than held more traditionally within the council building. And in terms of planning policy documents, there's a paragraph at the top which is sort of highlighted in bold, making it clear that this is a temporary change and there are things that unfortunately we can't do at the moment, notably hard copies, which we tend to have available within the main City Hall and also within Millennium Library. That's not really possible at the moment due to several concerns. Obviously the buildings themselves aren't fully open to the public, but also the sharing of hard copies isn't recommended. In terms of planning applications, very similar again, we can't have hard copies of the larger applications available to the public, which we used to do. There's also a section where we expect developers of larger sites to engage with the community themselves before submitting an application. So we've noted that we would expect developers to obviously respond to the government's guidance, but also use their own initiative really and sort of take a different approach to how they would communicate and explain that within any application. So to conclude, we're looking for you to endorse the proposed changes, which are temporary. We would expect to make a more thorough review next year, and they endeavour to simply address the current pandemic. And the wording has been done to allow the restrictions to either be lifted or, fingers crossed, restricted even further. Any questions?
Right, then, thank you very much for that. And I think I've just got one kind of question or point I'd like to make that which you've to some extent addressed, and that is the idea of a review. When you're saying you've built in already the ability to lighten these changes or make them sort of even more draconian, and I think that that's important. And but I do think, in view of this, we ought to undertake as an agenda item for a future SDP that we just once again say, are these changes necessary or not? That's a difficult thing to say when that would be, but if I ask either yourself or Graham, if we were to say in 6 months' time, where would that take us to? April, where would we be on that? And what I do think we need to review, and I'm just asking what would be a suitable period.
I think because of the circumstances we're in, it's very difficult to put a time frame on that. We don't quite know where we are with the ultimate lifting of the COVID-19 restrictions. What Catherine's just taken us through is frankly temporary changes to the statement of community involvement that particularly would allow us to consult on the next version of the Greater Norwich local plan, because how we would have historically consulted on that we can't do with the lockdown restrictions. Frank, as soon as those lockdown restrictions no longer exist and there's no health risk in us meeting the public and getting out and about in the way that we previously would, we'd want to revisit this anyway. So we'll bring it back to yourselves through the panel and then cabinet in terms of what it may look like going forward. But I'm a bit reluctant to give you a precise date over when that will be, but I'm more than happy to note that when this should be kept under review, and when the restrictions change, that we'll reconsider the temporary measures that we're proposing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Go ahead.
Do you mind if I just add a bit onto that?
Yeah, go ahead, Catherine. Yeah.
The current guidance on the government website allows for the amendment up until the end of the year. As Graham alluded to, if the pandemic, if the situation hasn't changed, the guidance itself may change to allow it to allow the document to remain changed.
Okay, thank you. That's clear enough. And I think the wording, keeping it under review, is sufficient. Now, Martin, you've got your hand up, but if you just wait a moment, because oh gosh. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. So, Councillor Schmierer, please unmute and speak.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I think that my first question was just about been answered by, because I was just wondering about this 31st of December date. The government have already indicated that there's a potential that this is going to carry on for another 6 months or so, and that was only a couple of weeks ago. So there is a chance that that may actually need to be prolonged, and I don't know what the mechanism will be to prolong that. I think, and I don't know if there's an SDP meeting that's scheduled between now and the end of the year. So I think we might have to look at the mechanism for that, unless you can maybe clarify that, Catherine. The other thing I want to just flag up is paragraph 10, which does deal with the sort of role of the councillors, and I'm really pleased to see that what you mentioned here is hybrid meetings may be considered, but I think going forward there's actually a lot of merit to this. And indeed, you mentioned about sort of vulnerable groups actually having the option of hybrid meetings whereby things can happen remotely actually will increase potentially participation. So that's something to be very much welcomed, and I certainly would welcome it. And my last point is actually much more of a question, and you've raised it already, which is about this strongly encouraging applicants, so paragraph 15, to consult the local community before submitting a planning application. Can you maybe give me some more details about what you mean by this strongly encourage? Are there any mechanisms by which to get applicants and developers to do the actual consultation work that we would consider de rigueur in normal times in these times, please?
Can I, just before Catherine answers, I think you've made 3 good points. I mean, the first one has to some extent been addressed. The second is a wider issue relating not just to planning, but all the other meetings that we hold, and it's something which I guess will be addressed in another forum. But in principle, I do sympathise with your view. So the third point, Catherine, I'd be grateful then if you could address that, please.
There's an obligation for developers of larger sites, and I'm just trying to find what the threshold is. Perhaps one of my other planning colleagues might know off the top of their head. But there's an obligation where developers have to engage with the public prior to submission, and those details would be submitted at that stage.
Can I just add that that's in the, I think that's on page 74 of the papers, and that's in the SCI. It says paragraph 64, the council strongly encourages applicants to consult the local community on developments of over 10 or more dwellings. Is that the reference, Catherine?
Yes, thank you. Right, so sorry, the question was around what type of community engagement we would expect as an alternative.
Yes, and also I suppose what sanctions, if that's for want of a better word, or what bonuses, if for want of again a better word, developers would get as basically the process of what you call strongly encouraging, what that basically would entail.
That makes sense, Catherine?
It does, thank you. I'm not entirely sure how to answer this. And Judith, could you add a bit on?
Yeah, well, I was just looking again at the document, page 75. There's an example of the of how a pre-application consultation should be conducted, and requiring what the applicants will have to do. But I think, sorry, there's a bit more detail going through on the following pages as well. But I'm sorry, I haven't sort of read this very recently.
Judith, I think the background to this is the requirement or the strong encouragement in the statement of community involvement for developers to engage directly at pre-application stage with communities was written that way because we simply don't have a legal ability to require them to do it. So strong encouragement was as much as we could do. And that's all we can do. So we can't refuse to determine an application if a developer hasn't deemed to engage with ourselves at pre-application stage or engage with the communities. But all our discussions with developers are that it's very much in your own interest to do it, because if anybody fails to do it, we do alert our own members through Planning Applications Committee to their abject failure to engage with either ourselves or the communities around proposals. And whilst we would be at pains to stress that members couldn't use that as a reason for refusal, it does broadly colour their attitudes towards developments in a wider sense, and most of the development industry know that. So the vast majority of major developments do undergo informal pre-application consultation, both directly with the public and with ourselves.
So it's the equivalent of a strong letter or a stiff letter. It exhibits an aspiration or a hope or an expectation, and it's a wise thing to do. So and we encourage people to do wise things. Okay, I can see no other people who now. Yes, please come in, Denise. Go ahead.
Very much. Thank you. Catherine, can I ask please about the arrangements for the public consultation on the Greater Norwich Local Plan Regulation 19 document, please? Because presumably it's going to be done remotely now.
Well, I think before Catherine comes in there, I think what we're looking at are, as I recall, if I read correctly, we're looking at this document and the temporary changes to it. So I think there is no point in answering. That's a point of detail. That is not about this document.
Chair, I think just to clarify, the statement of community involvement that we're preparing here applies to all planning documents that the City Council produce. So the consultation on the next stages of the Greater Norwich Local Plan would have to be conducted in accordance with the procedures that are set out in this document, assuming it is approved by Cabinet at the next meeting. I think the answer to Councillor Carlo's question is, as yet, a degree of uncertainty, as I think has been flagged up. You know, the government legislation around coronavirus that allows us to operate in the way that is set out in this document only lasts until the 31st of December. We're not expecting to consult on the Greater Norwich Local Plan in advance of that timetable, so it will depend on that being extended and then us reviewing the statement of community involvement again. But I think where we are with the pandemic, we would logically expect that to be continued. So I think assuming we move forward with a Regulation 19 consultation on the Greater Norwich Local Plan in February, March next year, we would expect the consultation to be conducted in accordance with this document that's set out. Okay,
thanks, Graham. I think the important thing is we're talking about for all planning applications, and I really don't want to run down a rabbit hole and then start asking questions about every planning application that is in. what the details are, and that wasn't my intention, and it still is. So we're looking at, in relation to this document, then, are there any other, I'm looking across, I have 2 screens and no raised hands. So if you, just to repeat the recommendation, he says, looking for the first page again, which I think is something like to endorse. Yeah, endorse the changes to the document and make a recommendation to Cabinet that we adopt that updated statement. Is everyone happy to endorse it? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Now, I wasn't expecting to share, but if I look carefully down, we've done all the business. I'm grateful for everyone and to the planning team who've sort of rolled their sleeves and got deep into some documentation that, you know, I'm glad they did it and not, you know, yeah, thanks again for the work that you do, all of you, for, in this case, Catherine, Joy, Judith and Graham. I'm very grateful to you, I'm sure we all. And on that note, I wish you all farewell, and it's not going to rain till this afternoon sometime, so see if you can get some outdoor activity in. Cheerio now.
Thank you very much.